So, hi guys, and welcome back to Autism Journeys radio show. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Barry Prasant, who is a speech and language pathologist, a visiting scholar at Brown University. He also consults and presents internationally, and he has been twice an invited speaker for World Autism Day by the United Nations. He remains actively involved in consultation with families and schools, and he also currently consults and is on the board of directors for not one but two performing and expressive arts programs. So Barry, thank you so much for agreeing to have a chat with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sharon. Thank you.
Great. Listen, Barry, we've loads to get through, so I'm going to get right started to it if that's okay with your first question.
Absolutely.
So Barry, I suppose first and foremost, just to give my listeners a little bit of background about yourself, can I ask you, why did you first decide to focus on autism? Because I'm aware that you've been working in the field for many number of years.
Yeah, actually, if you count my summer camp experience when I was a teenager, I've just passed 50 years. That's
Wow.
50 years. And that's what really got me involved. I started working at summer camps when I was 18 or 19 years of age. And I just loved working with the children and with the adults who had various labeled disabilities, and a number of them had the diagnostic label of autism. And so these were residential camps. So we lived with the children and the adults, usually for 2 full months every summer. And it really gave me that, what I still consider to be that very important perspective of being a caregiver, but being responsible for the happiness, the safety, the fun, day in and day out over a 2 month period. And not having a child with autism or any kind of labeled disability, that experience grounded me before I went on academically. And then I went on to an undergraduate degree in a fancy field called psycholinguistics, uh, which has to do with understanding the relationship between how we think and how we communicate. And at the same time, working with people during the summers with problems in communicating. Went on speech language pathology degree, did my master's thesis and doctoral dissertation in autism in the 1970s. And was there really at the very beginning of, in the US, the National Society for Autistic Children, which is now the Autism Society of America. And even though I didn't overlap in the refrigerator parent era, where some people, mostly child psychiatrists, thought that, well, autism was caused by bad parenting, um, I was enough at the fringe of that that I saw and I knew many parents who were exposed to that. So I've been through a few eras in the history of autism, which I think has given me kind of a more sensitive perspective in how parents were treated, how decades ago autistic people were thought of and children were thought of as less than human. And the phrase that I use was when autism was primarily viewed through the lens of pathology,
Yeah.
which unfortunately it still is. We're still trying to make that shift. And I would say one of the biggest changes for me over the last 15 years or so has been working closely with self-advocates.
Okay.
We've been doing a parent retreat for many years, and for many years we did a conference. And I would say, I think our conference going back to the 1990s was one of the first conferences that would virtually every year have a person on the spectrum who
Yeah.
spoke. And that was very important to me. And now I have very close friends on the spectrum outside of autism, where our families just get together for a fun time, um, pulled back with COVID a little bit. And I still consider to be people on the spectrum and families as my mentors, the people I've learned the most from.
Fantastic, fantastic. I suppose, Barry, immediately your passion shines through, and immediately it's very evident that from the very beginning that you've kept that person central always. And I suppose lots of different areas are now starting to catch up with the idea that that person needs to be central. So at least we see a shift. It'd be great if that shift happened faster,
Yes.
but for now, at least we see a shift. And I suppose, Barry, can I ask you, with regards to the fact that you've been there to witness so much of this change and transition around that kind of whole autism diagnostic piece, I suppose what part of that was most interesting for you, with regards to, like, coming from your standpoint as both in a speech and language pathologist, but also as a person who keeps that autistic voice central at the back of their minds always as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been most interesting, but also most validating for our research and our work is things that we were saying. I mean, my doctoral dissertation was on echolalia, where I demonstrated that echolalia is often functional and a part of language development, when the more radical behavioral psychologists, such as Lovaas, was saying it's meaningless parroting and we need to extinguish it and punish it. So I look back at my doctoral dissertation, done in the 70s, articles published. We published about 10 articles and chapters on echolalia. Things we were saying in the 70s, now autistic people are saying to me, Barry, you got it right. That's what that was. And then when I did work with, with Amy Laurent and with Amy Weatherby, all the work we've done over the years, looking at communicative intent underlying so-called challenging behavior. Okay, so a youngster drops to the floor. Is that non-compliant behavior, or is that a child protesting or saying, I can't handle this? It's too overwhelming on a sensory level. Is it letting us know what they're feeling inside? So many things we wrote about decade after decade. Now, over the last 10 years, especially, people on the spectrum are saying, yeah, what you were saying was accurate. Both myself as a non-autistic researcher, and I guess you could say academic to some extent, and so many people were guessing at what the autistic experience was. A lot of people were guessing wrong.
Yeah.
And those were the people who really looked primarily through the lens of pathology and tried to discourage, if not distinguish, self-stimulatory behavior that may be self-regulatory, okay?
Yeah.
Echolalia, which may be a part of language development. So many things that people did that not only were wrong, but were harmful.
Yeah.
But now we hear from so many people on the spectrum about so-called treatments to help them actually were traumatic for them. So I think for me, that's been the thing that's been most eye-opening, and again, validating. Because, for me, something I always try to say to young professionals, that if you are doing your work right, it's not just your work, it's part of your life's journey.
Yeah.
And it becomes part of who you are, and it makes you a better person if you connect with people with autism, because people with autism are such good people.
Yeah.
In terms of everything from their honesty, their sincerity, not playing the social games. I mean, so many things I could say as to how much we can learn from people with autism. So I always try to get across, especially to young professionals, don't think that you go to your work and you go home, whatever it is, after a day of work, and you disconnect. Because a good professional in the field, a good support person, even if they don't have a degree, never disconnects from other things that happen in their lives that they could learn from.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. That conversation back there in the back of your head all the time, trying to problem solve and figure things out. I think that's what makes, I suppose that's what makes us people who are best positioned actually to support autistic individuals, because when you're always cognizant and mindful of how to improve things and how to make sure that things are okay, and always kind of mulling over how to do so, then you're doing a good job. We might get things wrong, but we're trying all of the times to get things right.
Exactly. And I think if you have the attitude that we're always learning,
Yeah.
and we are evolving to help autistic people have a better quality of life. A big part of my work, with the parent retreat we've been doing for 25 years has been to how can we develop trusting relationships with parents? Because as you well know, Sharon, sometimes parents say, the autism thing, we kind of have that somewhat under control, or we're doing okay with that. But the problem we have is with professionals and systems that are disrespectful, that are not supportive, that create more stress for us. So
Yeah,
all I'm saying is, if you have that respectful attitude that we don't know everything, we're all learning together. We could learn from people on the spectrum. Right away, if you're a professional, parents will respect you for
yeah.
that. And that helps that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose when you speak about parents, it's very important actually that I suppose I'd be both parent and professional in the field now at this point in time. But I suppose I'm very mindful of the fact that there there's still it's still necessary that there's a move to ensuring that the parent's voice is heard by the professional as well, because right now I'm lucky to be surrounded by some wonderful professionals and have been for the last number of years, but I'm very aware of that parental voice who is feeling not heard. Do you know? So I suppose it's really important that there's a shift not only to listening to the autistic voice and absolutely keeping that central, but also listening to the parental voice to ensure that the parent is empowered to meet the needs of the young person who they care for. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And you wear a very unique set of hats,
Yeah,
because I also work with I refer to them as professional parents or parent professionals. And when I say you wear a unique set of hats, is you can go back and forth. You could think about your own experiences as a parent,
yeah,
especially probably with your first kids very early on around diagnosis.
yeah,
But then you have the professional knowledge to be able to step back and see that dynamic between other professionals and parents.
yeah.
And that's so valuable. I mean, some of the people I love working with and speaking to are both parents and professionals.
Yeah, yeah. And tell me, Barry, this weekend, this retreat weekend that you're talking about, what is that? I know that you mentioned earlier that it's not happening this year because of the current pandemic, unfortunate situation that we're in. But what essentially do you look at over that retreat weekend in the year?
Yeah, yeah. Just a little bit of background. My wife is a clinical psychologist and a nurse and a bioethicist.
Jeepers.
And she's affiliated with Harvard University in the medical school there. And many, many years ago, before we had our child, we have one boy who's now about to go to medical school, but that's a whole other story. And he's worked a lot with people on the spectrum, by the way. He's been infused into everything we do. So the parent retreat started because we like to go hiking, we like to get away. And I remember on a hike, you know, my goodness, 20, maybe close to 30 years ago, my wife and I said to each other, we're so fortunate to have this opportunity. But we both work with families, and my wife works mostly with families who have kids with medical illnesses. We both work with families where parents don't have that chance to refuel and
Yeah,
get away. And we said, wouldn't that be amazing to make that happen? And I was close with a number of parents who run a state-funded family support center in the state of Massachusetts. Um, as a matter of fact, we're having a Mother's Day special podcast on our podcast, and I invited the founder and director of that center. Her
wow.
name is Barbara. I've known Barbara for 30 years, since her son was 3 and her son's 33 now. Um,
Jeepers.
yeah. And so we went to Barbara because she was just beginning this agency. And I said, listen, we have an idea. We can't do this as professionals alone. We have to do this with you and your parent professional staff. We found this beautiful country setting affiliated with a university in our area. And what we said was, our initial intentions were kind of low, in the sense that if we provide a breather and a getaway from the stresses of everyday life, that's good enough. Okay. It ended up being so much more than that. So we have a weekend that begins on Saturday morning, ends after lunch on Sunday. We have arrangements for the parents to be there. We've had parents of literally either newly diagnosed kids or a child not even yet diagnosed, but about to get diagnosed,
Hmm.
in the same setting for a weekend with parents of adult children in their 20s and 30s. Up to 50 to 60 parents. We had fundraising conferences, so the costs were minimal, and along with free scholarships for parents who could not pay for it.
Fab.
Incredible food. This center happened to have just wonderful, wonderful catering and food, and very rustic setting in the country. Cabins, beautiful country setting. And then we have a number of different discussion groups that are planned throughout the 2 days. We have fun activities. I play in a band, so my band plays a dance for Saturday night very
Fab.
often. But we've had other musicians come in. And I mean, there are some very seminal parts of the weekend. One is the closing circle, where we all sit together in one room in a large circle, and everybody has a chance to reflect on what they're going to take away from the weekend. In my book,
Fantastic.
Uniquely Human, in one of the chapters, I talk about what I've learned and what parents have said at the parent retreat. What is so amazing to me, I've always seen it, but more kind of intermittent from a distance. But what's amazing to me in that weekend is how much the parents support each other, how much the parents take the new parents under their wing, parents who are exposed to the pathology mantra about autism. And then they see parents of a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old, even parents of kids or teenagers who by any measure are very challenged with seizure disorders, maybe non-speaking. And they say, wait a second, this family seems to be pretty balanced and happy. And so all of this sharing, this mentoring goes on. And I have the great ability, and my wife does, as the only professionals there, to sit back and just watch it all unfold. And we don't have the same parents every year. There's always turnover with new parents and other parents who can't make it. But we have a core group of parents to keep the culture alive. It's a culture of respect. It's not a culture of, I'm going to fix your problems for you. It's a culture of, I'm here to listen and to bear witness to what your experience is. A lot of parents don't want a relative stranger to say, oh, you need to do this and you need to do this. Some parents want that, but other parents just want to be heard.
Yeah.
And that's so essential.
Yeah.
What we've started about 5 or 6 years ago is having autistic people come. I mean, we've always had some either diagnosed or non-diagnosed dads on the spectrum there, okay?
Yeah.
But now we have self-advocates come, many of them published authors. Um, I, I think we're going to talk a little bit about theater later on. We had a young man who was told, when his parents were told he would never go anywhere, he would never graduate high school. He's a leading actor in a professional theater company now. So he came a couple of years ago and spoke. He's now 26. He spoke to the parents about his journey.
Yeah.
Um, so it's Amy Laurent, who you've interviewed, has come and she has spoken to parents and run some discussion groups and parents. So we have small groups, and then we have large group activities. The meals are very important. We always have a buffet meal, and the meals are a time where everybody could just let their hair down and have fun and relax. So that's it. And for some parents say, excuse me, the parent retreat, believe it or not, happening once a year has saved their marriages
Yeah.
because they connect with other parents. A lot of the parents stay connected throughout the year. There's a retreat Facebook page. Um, and so it continues. Now with COVID, we hear a lot from parents about how sad they are that we had to skip the retreat
Yeah.
this year. And everybody's, unfortunately, this is nothing to do with us, but the retreat center run by the university has shut down and they're not going to continue. So right now, we were in the same place for 24 years and we're looking for a new beautiful country setting. So
Okay, okay. It sounds amazing, actually, Barry, and I suppose it speaks to the power of that peer-to-peer support, doesn't it? It speaks to that how effective empowering parents can be to be able, rather than telling somebody what to do, being able to empower them and by gifting them the tools to be able
yeah,
to support themselves and their family units. Do you know?
exactly. And the word that I always like to emphasize in recent years, especially, is community.
Yeah,
The retreat has created a community. And even if parents don't see each other at the times that the retreat's not happening, which is most of the year, they still feel connected to a community, and it's a different community. I remember one mom said to me, you know, Barry, I've been going to a support group for years, but this is so totally different than in my schedule running at 4 in the afternoon to catch the meeting of the support group or in the
yeah,
evening. Um, this is immersion in getting away, clearing your mind out from everyday issues, we take care of all of the needs of the parents. They know where they're going to sleep, all their meals are taken care of. And all of a sudden, all the things they need to be thinking about for their family, they don't have to think about that we
Yeah,
arrange everything to be taken care of for them.
yeah. That moment to breathe, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah. Barry, can I ask you, I suppose, just to let my listeners know that you are one of the co-authors of the SCERTS program, that SCERTS model or the SCERTS framework. And I suppose the SCERTS, I know that I've completed SCERTS training and so on, and it is an absolutely amazing framework that can be implemented in any educational setting and so on. And we're forever advocating that local schools here might implement it and so on. But for those of my listeners who aren't yet familiar with the SCERTS program and how I suppose the ethos and the values underpinning it, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. I guess, when you talk about the different ways we talk about different approaches and different frameworks or models, certs would fall into the category of a developmental and relationship-based model. It's developmental because it is totally grounded in the research on child and human development, and also on how people and children on the spectrum develop, which in some ways is different. A lot of my research in echolalia and repetition of speech, we have a developmental model of echolalia. It isn't just something that's, okay, we should need to get rid of, as some people have said. It's relationship based because at the heart of the SERTS model, when it works, actually when any approach works, is when there's a trusting relationship between a person and a child on the spectrum, and between a professional and the parents as well. It's also family centered, that we see families as collaborators and partners. So in a sense, it's not an expert model. It's not Barry's coming in as the expert and going to tell you
Yeah,
everything to do and just do this. It's Barry's going to come in and he's really going to listen to you as a parent, to you as a teacher, and we're gonna, what I like to say is, when I consult, I become part of the team. I'm not outside of the team kind of throwing these gems of wisdom down on them. And if people feel like, okay, that's a gem of wisdom, thank you, that's okay. But it's based upon what we feel are the three domains that are the underpinnings of success in almost anything that a person on the spectrum, or actually anything that any person needs in their lives. The first is social communication. That's the SC of SERTS. And that has to do with being heard, understanding other people, being able to say and have some kind of impact on your life by expressing your emotions, by expressing your needs.
yeah,
We include play in that for young kids, the importance of play in development. But the ultimate goal of social communication is developing those trusting relationships. The people we trust the most are the ones that there is an easy and effective flow of communication back and forth. When we say somebody gets us, it's because they've communicated effectively to us, and we have communicated effectively to them. Under social communication, a big focus on expressing emotions and understanding other people's emotions. So that's the first part. There are three parts. The second part is emotional regulation. Um, and that has to do, I like to describe emotional regulation in this way. When we are well regulated, and it's not just emotionally in terms of being content, not being anxious, it's also physiologically, when we feel comfortable in our body, when we're processing sensory information that's not dysregulating to us. Okay, so emotional regulation, when things are going well, goes for anybody. We are most available for learning, and we're most available for engaging with other people. We know that. We know when we've had a good day or a good activity, or we're in the zone. That's what we strive for. The whole idea of highlighting emotional regulation in autism is that people with autism are at high risk for many factors that are dysregulating factors. Everything from biomedical issues, gastrointestinal issues, sleep disorders, to anxiety, being worried too much, not being able to let the worry go out of your mind, needing more routine than other people to stay grounded, needing more predictability
Mm.
than other people to stay grounded. And actually, in the SCERTS manual, we talk about 10 different categories of dysregulating factors for people on the spectrum. And let me also say, being developmental, these are also categories of factors that are dysregulating for any person. But what we emphasize is that people on the spectrum in general do not naturally develop the coping strategies. So a lot of what we do in the emotional regulation domain of SCERTS is understand how a person is trying to cope. Okay, why is he rocking? Why is he staring at his fingers? Why is he so-called stimming at those times and not at other times? Why does he talk to himself? Why does he say, it's okay, don't worry, everything will be okay? All of these are strategies to stay well regulated. But we also want to teach people on the spectrum strategies that are effective and ideally strategies that are more socially desirable. So if a student feels anxious in a classroom, they may get up and run out of the classroom down the hallway in the school. Well, that's a strategy to decrease anxiety, but is it effective and socially desirable? Maybe we could teach that student to ask for a break when they're feeling that way. It has the same purpose, but it's more socially desirable and effective. Okay, so that's emotional regulation is a huge area. And many people say it actually is the most novel contribution of the SCERTS model. Because up until we introduced emotional regulation, everybody's talking about behavior management, behavior management. How do I manage the child's behavior? And what we say is, wait a second, it's not simply about managing the surface behavior. It's about understanding that person's experience and giving them the tools
Yeah.
to stay well regulated. Huge difference. And one thing I do like to say, this is a shameless plug, is that we introduced the concept of emotional regulation to the field of autism in articles in the early 1990s, in
Wow.
published articles. Then it became part of the SCERTS model after the year 2000. Now it's one of the hottest areas of research
Yeah.
in autism. And of course, with incredible colleagues like Amy Laurent and Emily Rubin, and all of this has been developed hand in hand. Really important. Finally, transactional support is all of the ways, that's the TS, is all of the ways we support children and adults on the spectrum, we support their families, and all of the ways we support each other as professionals. So the notion of transactional is, I'll give some examples. If I am well regulated as a teacher, my kids are going to be better regulated, okay? If I could provide emotional and educational support to parents, that's going to trickle down in helping the
Yeah.
parents support their kids better. So it's a deeply embedded support model. It's not just as simple as, oh, I put up a visual support like a calendar. Now that's transactional support, but we want that student or that person to actively use the calendar by themselves. So it isn't just as a teacher, well, first we're doing this and next we're doing this, okay? The ultimate goal of it being transactional is, oh, the child understands if I'm a little bit anxious and I'm not sure what's going to happen next, I can go over to my calendar and use it.
Yeah.
And mom and dad could use it at home to help me. So what we do is we connect the supports to supporting social communication and emotional regulation. If you have the skills and you are developing effective skills in social communication and emotional regulation, it will help you in potty training.
Yeah.
It will help you in algebra in high school. It will help you going on a family picnic. It will help the family in taking you into situations that may be a little anxiety producing. It's a model that is grounded in goals for home, school, and community. It cuts across all settings. So that's it in a nutshell. And you know, the one thing, again, what's so validating is people on the spectrum, including in the United States, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. They really like the SCERTS model. They
Yeah.
say, autistic people are saying, thank you. This is addressing our needs and it's respectful of us. And that's another thing we're so proud of.
Absolutely. And I suppose, Barry, I did the training in person a few years ago before this blooming pandemic took hold and all that. And I can remember looking around the room at different educators and professionals, and you could nearly see these light bulb moments pinging over people's heads, kind of going, "Oh, okay, that actually makes sense." So, like, I mean, to be in a training where you can nearly see this happening live speaks to the efficacy and to the I suppose the respect piece that is central to the SCERTS framework as well. I definitely find it to be hugely helpful. But one question I would have around it is quite literally is that oftentimes when we speak to teachers and educators and other professionals about implementing it into school, and obviously then we want to generalize these kind of structures and supports to a home setting. How do we support parents to foster that kind of a positive environment for the development of those kind of three facets of the SCERTS program? Because, oftentimes something will land in school and just stay in school, or will land in a community centre and just stay in that centre.
Yes. Yeah, I think it happens by parents seeing literally SCERTS in action and learning some of the language that we use in the SCERTS model. I think that's, I mean, and any approach has, ABA approaches has their language, which tends to me, for me, a little bit less transparent in a way. But I think that one of the beauties of SCERTS is it's an activity-based model. And what I mean by that is we believe, and I mean, this is a no-brainer, but we believe that any person develops and learns in every activity in their lives. It doesn't have to be a sit-down training session. So, I mean, we talk about setting goals and objectives in making cookies at home, going on a picnic. What are the social communication abilities that we could practice and work on there? What are the challenges to being well regulated emotionally, and what supports can we put into place? So I think it's, when I speak to parents, I want to know if the parents are willing to share, tell me a little bit about home life. Tell me a little bit about the activities that you do at home, and then connect strategies from the SCERTS model
Yeah.
into those activities and those goals. I think as long as we talk too technically and we stay too much on a technical level, as if it's therapy only or education only happens in schools,
Yeah.
then a lot of parents are going to say, I'm not a teacher. That's a little too much for me. But because it's an activity-based model, I love talking about, well, what's the routine when your kids come home from school? And if a parent says, well, when my son comes home and my daughter comes home and they all go off to their own rooms, and I wish they would play together. Okay, let's set that up as a goal. And maybe let's talk to the people at school about peer play,
Yeah.
and let's look at what the kids love to do. So it really has to come down to practical routines in the home setting, and the parents not feeling I have to sit my child down at a desk and be their teacher. Now, if they want to do that, fine. That's okay. But it works best when it's in the flow of life, and it's not just something that, I need to make myself be a teacher and my child be a student.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's really important that parents, any parents listening into this, would hear that message specifically, because sometimes there's just a barrier to engaging with any kind of a support like that because of a fear around potentially not feeling equipped enough to be able to implement it. But as you say, when it's almost naturally inbuilt into the routine and the flow of the family home as well as the school setting, we definitely support generalization and set the young person up for success then moving forward as well. So to any parent listening in, it's something that can absolutely be achieved in the home as well, I
And,
suppose.
and let me also mention one unique characteristic of the SCERTS model, and that is we embrace other evidence-based practices.
Yeah.
So you might be familiar with the Hannon Center in Toronto, Canada.
Yeah.
I'm a Hannon-trained speech and language pathologist. For those people not familiar with Hannon, very simply, it's a center that teaches professionals how to support families. And the basis of Hannon is everyday activities and routines. So we use Hannon strategies And we encourage parents to get involved, or professionals to get involved in hand-in training to know how to best support families in their home
Yeah.
routines. So we could pull in these areas of approaches and strategies from other approaches under the umbrella.
Yeah.
So the Hannon program would be a transactional support to work with families.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that's the beauty of SERTS, is that it isn't an exclusive, it's not an exclusive framework that I know people use core boards, or people might use the hand and talkability program now, for example, or whatever the case may be, but that all of these can be encompassed under that SERTS framework, so that we're making sure that things that are already supporting the child continue to support the child as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Barry, where can listeners find out more about about it, or how to get trained up in it? And like, I'm mindful now again that everything is moved online right now, but how can people access the training, should they want to do training, or just to learn more about it, generally speaking?
Yeah, there's on Facebook, there is a SERTS Facebook page, and it's linked to an event listing of SERTS trainings. Some SERTS trainings are closed. What I mean by that is it might be a specific agency or school, and it's
Yeah.
just for their staff. Some are open. My colleagues, Emily Rubin, Amy Laurent, and myself as well. Now with Zoom, we do Zoom SERTS trainings. Um, the manuals are translated into 3 languages, and actually we get requests all the time for many more translations. And if you want to get a feel of SERTS, if you know nothing about it and you don't want to read anything technical, my book, Uniquely Human, does not teach SERTS, but all of the stories I tell about kids and families are grounded in the core values and principles of SERTS. So you get a good feeling of how SERTS works there. And the thing about my book, Uniquely Human, is it's translated into 18 languages.
Mhm.
So you can get a real feel of what that's like. But yeah, the best place for the most current trainings is on the SERTS event Facebook page right now.
And maybe, Barry, you might send me on actually a link to that page
Sure.
specifically, because I know I'm on one of the search pages, but I don't know is it the right one or not. It was one that I joined following training, if that makes sense. So, if you send me that on, I can make sure that that's under this podcast in the information piece, if that's okay. Um,
Absolutely.
Barry, with regards to your book, your book, Uniquely Human, a different way of seeing autism. I suppose, what was your inspiration for the book? What do you want to tell people what it's about? Why it is such a fantastic book to read, and so on.
Yeah, the inspiration is it's kind of a unique inspiration, I would say, is that almost all my publications and research has been in technical journals, chapters in the handbooks of autism, and very kind of high level scholarly, proud to say, very reputable places. Journals of speech language pathology, child psychiatry, child psychology. And at the same time that over the decades that we're publishing all this work, I would come home after a school consultation and say to my wife and to my son, um, oh, I met this great kid today. Let me just tell you this story. And so I would always tell stories. And my wife, who is a professional, as I mentioned, she would say, I learned so much about autism. She's not an expert in autism, quote unquote expert. And for many years, she said, you need to write a book that is a book of stories, that's a mainstream book. So that's really the reason. And then I had one of my mentors who's now in his 80s now. He's actually an audiologist and very close friend when I worked at Emerson College in Boston. And he said to me, Barry, it's great that you're publishing all this stuff, but you are so grounded. You're not an ivory tower academic. You're so grounded in what you do. He said, when are you going to write your freaking book? And the word wasn't freaking, it was something else. And I took it to heart. And so I developed a proposal. I knew a lot of my writing style was more technical, so I wanted somebody to look at my writing and help it be a little bit more engaging. And just as one of those things, the right people come into your life at the right time. I met a man named Tom Fields Meyer, who not only is a professional human interest writer, but has an adult son on the spectrum. Uh, and so Tom kind of helped me to make the book much, much more engaging for anybody who would read it. And so that the book was published almost 6 years ago. It's been the best-selling book in autism in the United States ever since.
Yeah.
You always expect books to kind of drop out. The book is actually more popular in terms of sales now than it was when it first came out, which is the
Absolutely.
total opposite of what usually happens. So, and it's a major international publisher who've given me really good support, Simon and Schuster. And I think this is the first time I'm saying this publicly. We are now going to be, in the next few weeks, starting a revised and expanded edition that will be out for April Autism Acceptance Awareness Month in the next year, in 2022.
Fantastic.
Because so much has happened even in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
So we're adding chapters to it, and we're changing some of the stories, but the core of what the book is about will be there. It'll just be updated with more examples. Let me just share this with you. I never expected it to have the broad-ranging impact that it has. So if people are interested, at least on the Amazon Facebook page in the US, and that's where you get the most comments, and there are, oh my goodness, close to 2,000 reviews and over 800 comments. The comments come from parents of newly diagnosed kids. The comments come from well-known, reputable autistic self-advocates who you recognize their names.
Yeah.
The comments come from brothers who never quite understood why their 40-year-old brother acted this way. People have diagnosed themselves on the spectrum after reading Uniquely Human. And the general comment, I'm very proud. Out of 2,000 ratings, it's rated 4.8 out of 5. And the people who don't like it, very few, don't like the fact that we used person first language.
Yeah.
We wrote the book 7 years ago, which we're changing for the new edition
Yeah.
because times have changed. Okay. And they don't like the fact that I'm not autistic, that autistic people need to write books about autism.
Yeah.
And my response to that is, I'm not claiming this great insight into the autistic experience. I'm sharing with you what I have learned from 50 years of being with autistic people,
Yeah.
children, and their families. It's an outsider looking in. It's not, I am claiming this is the truth about autism.
Yeah.
And for me, what is validating is when people on the spectrum and families say, Barry, you got something here. This has been our experience. Thank you for doing that. And actually, quite honestly, I don't want to sound defensive, but many autistic people have come to the defense of a non-autistic person writing Uniquely Human. So let me add one comment. This is brand new. A couple of weeks ago, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network in the United States, a very important, incredibly knowledgeable group of autistic people, they put out a list of 10 books that every parent should read when their child gets a diagnosis. Uniquely Human was the only book not written by an autistic person on their list.
So there we go. It speaks for itself, Barry, doesn't it?
And that for me is the greatest joy.
Yeah.
It's nice when I get a review from a reputable professional who's not autistic, but it's wonderful when a parent says, this has been our experience and what you're sharing has been very helpful. Or an autistic person saying, and this comes from one of the reviews, saying, he gets us.
Yeah.
He understands our experience. This is unbelievable. Everything is doom and gloom.
Yeah.
One other point I'll make very quickly, and that I bent over backwards not to sugarcoat autism. Some people hear the title, Uniquely Human, a different way of seeing autism. And, oh my God, this is going to be that it's just all strengths and there's no challenges. And oh my God, that's all we should look at. I give stories of families and people on the spectrum in distress. Yeah. It really experiencing extreme dysregulation. Yeah. I really worked hard, and I think it's respectful to say, this is not about sugarcoating or, oh, autism, la-di-da, it's not what we thought it was. it tries to give examples of the full range
Yeah.
and a balance, but saying we should not only pathologize autism because that leads to bad outcomes.
Absolutely, and I suppose on the flip side of that, Barry, one of my pet hates is to coin a phrase, inspiration porn, where you've got people
Yes.
who are making, like, it's, oh my gosh, look, these people have overcome this, and these are like, in spite of and despite, and so on and so forth. And actually, I do believe that that attitude can be very disrespectful and very unkind and very unhelpful, actually. So I really do think that it's important that we present autism in real terms to people, and be that through the lens of a professional who works with autistic individuals or autistic individuals themselves, that there does have to be a real terms approach to this.
Yes, and I like to say, yes, we have our Temple Grandins, and I happen to know Temple really well. She was the first autistic person who spoke at one of our conferences, and we have the Greta Thunbergs, and but every person's quality of life should be measured against kind of their trajectory, how they develop, and it's not just happiness; it's also a sense of achievement and accomplishment that a person feels. Happiness is an important part of that. But don't measure, your child's progress against, and I'm not saying what Temple has done or what Greta does is inspiration porn. It's when the media holds that up as kind of the only things they want
Yeah,
to talk about when they talk
that's
about
it.
them. Yeah,
That's it. That only this is where your child should be and has to be and must be. And anything outside of this ability is not worth the paper it's written on, so to speak. When in fact, like we have a saying in our house here, that we celebrate the little victories every day.
yeah,
Little victories fast become giant, amazing victories. But it's the littlest of victories that produce and create moments of joy.
yes,
And I
beautiful.
suppose that's the way in which we view things here, at least. Do you know?
And that's beautifully said. And that's one of the magical pieces of our parent retreat. So we will have a parent who says, oh, well, my son just graduated college with an engineering degree. And we'll have another parent who says, well, my daughter just sat through a full meal at the dinner table for the first time.
There
You
we
know,
go.
and everybody celebrates each one of those
Both of
achievements.
them. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Do you know? Barry, moving on from your book to your Uniquely Human podcast. Will you
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about this, please?
Yeah. One of the most common reactions that I've gotten to the book, and now I do presentations just on Uniquely Human, um, is, okay, Barry, what's next? This is, we've embraced this. It's been very helpful. Where are you taking this next? And a few years ago, I thought, oh, well, it'll be a totally different book. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of why that didn't work out the way I'd hoped, but it's a whole other issue. And then somebody said to me, actually, Tom, the person who kind of has helped with the writing a little bit, said, Barry, you just have a way of explaining complex things in a very, very engaging way. I love speaking to you about it. Why don't you do a podcast? And he said that about 2 years ago. And to tell you the truth, I had never listened to a podcast. And then, this is just one of these fortuitous things. I made a friend a few years ago named David Finch. Dave is on the spectrum, and he's a best-selling New York Times best-selling author. He published a book in 2012 called The Journal of Best Practices: How a Man with Asperger's Learned to Be a Better Father and a Better Husband. And it's hysterical. Dave he's a trained comedian. He's really funny. And so he and I were involved in a project or two. He lives halfway across the US from me. He lives in Denver. I'm on the East Coast. And then I it just hit me one morning. Wait, Dave is an audio engineer. He has a business where he develops podcasts for engineering companies. And Dave knew Uniquely Human inside out. As a matter of fact, after he read it, and we tell this story on the podcast, he read Uniquely Human, and his wife knew my work because she's a former speech language pathologist, all these crazy connections. And he calls me up. He goes, is this Dr. Barry Prasant? And I said, yeah. And he said, you don't know me. I'm Dave Finch. I love you. And I said, okay, that's interesting. It ended up that we were trying to develop, not but we were brought on to help develop a center in Colorado, which never worked out because I can't get into the specifics on that. But then it struck me just about less than a year ago. Wait a second. I'm ready to do a podcast, but I never knew anybody that I could trust to do a podcast with. Let me ask Dave. So I called Dave, and I hadn't spoken to Dave in about a year. And he said, Barry, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So we started doing it. We just recorded our 24th episode yesterday, and it's on emotional regulation, by the way. And Dave talks about his problems with emotion regulation. And Dave and I, people who listen to the podcast said, oh my God, it sounds like you're the best of friends. And we are good friends, but it sounds like, you've been doing a podcast together from the very first episode for years together. There's a nice flow. And we said, no expectations. Let's just go with it and see how it works. We think, it may not be, but we think it's the first co-hosted podcast with a non-autistic and an autistic person joining together.
Good.
So that enables us to talk about what's similar and different between the autistic and the non-autistic experience. With Dave having an incredible comedic sense of humor, we wanted to keep it lighter,
Yeah.
but also introduce serious topics. And we wanted to do some shows that were just Dave and I. Every third or so or fourth episode is just Dave and I, but also have guests. So we've had guests from around the world on talking about so many different things. We've had a non-speaking autistic person who types. We have had people who speak, but maybe not that fluently. And then we have people on the spectrum who have savant skills. We have a little section called Enthusiasm of the Week, which we don't get on every week if the interviews go longer, but we invite people. I'll invite you, Sharon. If if you know of a kid or one of your kids who has an enthusiasm, that's a term that I use in the book that
Yeah.
comes from Clara Claiborne Park, and you wish to share it, but not just share it, but how it has enhanced quality of life
Yeah.
for you and your family. So we have a backlog of recorded enthusiasms. Those are typically 10 to 15 minute segments. So just to give you an idea, yesterday we recorded 2 enthusiasms for future episodes. One interesting point, by the way. Usually, most people don't invite themselves onto the podcast. We invite them, people
Yeah.
we know, we're interested in their work. The only people who consistently invite themselves to the podcast are autistic people. so, so I got contacted by this man, David, about a month ago. Barry, I want to be on your podcast. Here are the 5 things I could talk about. And I said, well, we're kind of backed up a little bit with our interview schedule. And we had some people talk about this. And I saw World Traveler. And I said, David, would you be willing to do that as an enthusiast? Are you enthusiastic? Oh, absolutely. We interviewed him yesterday. He's a man on the spectrum in his 20s who's traveled to 40 countries. And his podcast is Tips for Autistic People if you want to travel internationally.
Wow.
And he was great. And then we had a mom on yesterday who said, ever since my son was 2 or 3 years of age, he was fascinated by hoses and cables. And as he got a little older, when we would go to the theater, we would ask, could we go backstage after a performance? And we developed a friendship with people in our local theater, so they let him come and they taught him how to wrap cables and connect cables. And now he's a 10-year-old who's very interested in electronics and other areas. So we have wonderful examples of, kids or adults who've had a deep interest, what we call an enthusiasm based upon Clara Claiborne Park's work, but it has not only enhanced quality of life for the child or the person, but for the family. So another enthusiasm, and this will be my last example, was a child who just loved to line up dominoes, and he would spend hours lining them up and knocking them over. And people told, you got to stop that obsession. And the mom, was very conflicted by that. And then she read Uniquely Human. She goes, you gave us a word where we could look at it positively. And she said, I started ignoring the people who said you need to stop that. And then she said, so when he comes home from school, the very first thing he does after a little bit of a stressful school day is he plays with his dominoes. And that's the way he regulates emotionally. And then she said, he would never easily play with my husband who wanted to play with him. But now they've developed all these games together around dominoes, and they have developed this play relationship with each other. So those are the kinds of stories we love to
Yeah,
hear. It doesn't
yeah,
have to be a sophisticated enthusiasm. It's how you've taken something that rivets your child's attention or a person's attention, and it's enhanced quality of life. And in many cases, things that were called undesirable or obsessive interests, and reframing that to
yeah.
respect the person who has that interest.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose one of my least favorite terms actually is monologuing, because I find that in our house, I've got one young person here who talks at great length about dinosaurs, and it's led to this wonderful these conversations about what your favorite letter is, because your favorite dinosaur is Parasaurolophus, so maybe your favorite letter is P, and it's built all of this lovely it's definitely maximized learning and so on, but it's also built this, like, it's allowed for me to have this lovely relationship with my little person, where he feels safe, where he can
Yeah.
share, where he can use it to regulate himself, where he can use it to just engage and to pull me into his world, and to entice me. And I suppose it's also built upon, or it's built on all of the skill sets that he needs to be able to actively and positively engage and communicate with his peers as he moves forward. So if we can't look at it as anything but one of these most wonderful, wonderful strengths, and it's important that people do actually see that. Do you know?
And I mean, what you just stated is a classic example of it's a choice we make. Do
Yeah,
we look at the cup half full or half empty?
yeah,
Do we say, how can we be creative in expanding? I mean, being a speech language pathologist, I mean, you want to work on conversational skills, which has to do with the reciprocity and the to and
yeah,
fro.
yeah,
Talk with the child about their interests,
yeah,
and then begin to expand,
yeah,
connect the dots to other things.
yeah.
And if a child or a person allows you to go with that, fine. If they say, no, no, I just want to talk about dinosaurs now, and I
And
don't want
that's
to talk
okay
about,
too.
that's right, that's right.
Exactly, exactly. Do you know, I just think that I love the fact that things are finally shifting toward a more strengths based approach. So, like, I suppose we acknowledge that people have areas of challenge, or have areas where they need support, but actually, rather than pathologizing, as you said,
Yeah,
looking instead at empowering kiddos with the knowledge that they have these wonderful, unique talents and strengths as well, so that
yeah,
we're preserving that mental well-being and so on as they grow.
yeah.
Do you know?
And I always like to say it's not just the right way to go because it makes us feel better. I mean, I know so many professionals who were stuck in programs that were deficit, checklist programs. And they said, I just didn't feel like me. I just didn't feel good. That's one
Yeah.
part of it. But it's what autistic adults are telling us
Mhm.
now.
Absolutely.
The autistic adults are saying the people I trusted the most and valued the most in my life were the ones who respected what I was interested in, no matter how unconventional it might have been. Maybe they would guide me to expand or in other directions. But the bottom line is, I felt that they connected with me, they got me, they respected me.
Yeah.
The worst case scenario is always telling a person, no, that's wrong. You need to stop doing that. I don't care if you like that. You know, uh, you have to not talk about that for the whole day, and then you get to earn this, whatever it might be. And then people talk now on the spectrum in the extreme about, I was traumatized by that.
Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah.
want to be around people. They were always telling me I was either getting it wrong or not talking about what it was important to focus on. So,
Absolutely, absolutely. As I say, I just have to say again that I'm so glad that we're moving away, because I've one very good friend and colleague who talks about conversations happening around cutting a little Cadbury's chocolate button in half to reward a child by, like, with a half a button, half a chocolate button for completing something. And when I think about, I'm going, oh sweet mother of God, we need to absolutely create moments where the young person is going to be implicitly motivated to
that's right.
want to engage with different activities and so on. Do you know? And Barry, can I ask you, with regards, as I've stated, you are a consultant and director on two boards of a performing and expressive arts schools. So we know that they're hugely wonderful areas of support and community for autistic individuals, and I suppose they're wonderful supports in maximizing learning potential, so to speak. Can you let me know a little bit about the work that the schools that you work with do in order to propel these young people forward?
Yes, yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not directors. I'm on the board of directors.
Sorry, board of director.
Because
Apologies.
these programs do have directors, yes. There are two programs that I'm involved in. One is a long-standing program. It's actually been around for about 12, 14 years.
Okay.
Was developed in Los Angeles. It's called the Miracle Project.
Okay.
And it was developed by Elaine Hall. And the best way to learn about the Miracle Project is there's a movie that came out about more than 10 years ago
Okay.
called Autism, the Musical.
Okay.
And when I first heard about it, I went, oh no, what's this about? And I saw the movie and I cried and I said, oh my God. I eventually became very close personal friends with the mother who developed it. Long story short, she couldn't have kids, so she adopted a child from Siberia at 2 years of age, who ended up being quote unquote severely autistic. But she had been a dance and acting coach for children in Hollywood movies. She lives in Los Angeles. She stopped doing that after adopting this child, but then she came back to it years later. Her name is Elaine Hall. And if you go, the website is
Okay.
themiracleproject.org,
I'm
O-R-G.
going to write that down now so that I have that and I can include it in the. I can include, actually, I might look it up and find
Oh,
maybe share a link on my Facebook page and so on as well, so that people can actually suss out more about it.
it's incredible. So I initially became involved on the board there because Elaine had come to a SCERTS model workshop
Okay.
and she saw the connection. So she has a son who is now in his 20s. He's non-speaking, he's severely dyspraxic. And he's part of their programs. They run multiple levels of Miracle Project programs in the Los Angeles area, but it's been adopted around the country, and outside of the country as well. It's a theater and expressive arts programs, and it's now being done on Zoom since COVID. And depending upon the ability levels of the participants, because they have it grouped by ability levels, they actually started a non-speaking class this year.
Fantastic.
Um, and everything from writing music to doing dancing to writing full plays, the highest level class, which is called the company class, they do full productions,
Okay.
hour and a half productions, not hour and a half, but up to an hour on in main theaters in Los Angeles. They've taken it to that level. Some of the young people who started out in the Miracle Project are now on television shows. There's a show, I don't know if you have, it's called Atypical.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
some of the actors in season 3 and season 4 are from the Miracle Project.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Elaine is a big advocate right now. One of her big missions is getting more and more autistic people into film and television.
Great.
Okay, so that's that. Okay, but it's mostly not professional level. Mostly it's for the kids to have fun. Their company class is kind of semi-professional.
Yeah.
The other company, the second company, is called the Spectrum Theater Ensemble. The
Okay.
Spectrum Theater Ensemble is a professional theater company. It's all adults currently. It's both programs, by the way, are inclusive, typically developing people and kids, non-disabled, and people on the spectrum or other disabilities. And the relationships often are called actor-co-actor relationships. So for every person who's on the spectrum, in most of their programs, there's a co-actor who's not. So Spectrum Theater Ensemble, again, you could look up Spectrum Theater Ensemble, Google it, get to their website. They write plays, they have playwrights as part of the staff. They also do very famous plays, some of which have been made into films. They did an award-winning production just before COVID of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Okay.
It was amazing. They're based locally where I live in Providence. Um, And they want to bring people, talented people who could work at a professional level on the spectrum. And by the way, it isn't just acting.
Yeah.
They train stage managers, they train set designers. It's everything having to do with putting on a theatrical production. They have a program called NICE, which is, I forget what it stands for, but it's sensory friendly consultation. So they consult to other theaters and performing places on how to be more sensory friendly to accept people on the spectrum into your audiences.
Fab.
Um, they're fantastic. I just amazing people, talented people who also are very aware of their autism and who talk about that. So that's quite amazing. I've learned so much from both programs. The Miracle Project Zoom program, we have brought that program to the East Coast in Brown University, where I have an
Yeah.
appointment. And I work with Amy Lorentz, part of the team. She helps to develop the visual supports for the program. And we have a music director who's a social worker and a music therapist. I told her for a number of years, we got to get a Miracle Project here. Her name is Shelley. And she goes, Barry, I've got too much of my life, I'm too busy. We finally got her involved 3 years ago. And she goes, oh my God, I should have been doing this years ago. She,
Fab.
she loves it. We have a movement and dance director.
Great.
So we bring all of this together. So we just finished an 8-week after school program. We do a summer camp,
Yeah.
which we may skip it this year because everybody wants to be outside and we still have the COVID restrictions.
Yeah.
Parents love seeing their kids or family members
Yeah.
be doing things that they never dreamt, whether it's singing a solo or whether it's being on stage and acting. Um, whether it's just even being on stage and having a small part in a play with people in the audience.
Yeah.
It's developing communities of support around the arts. A lot of our participants, not a lot, but some, are incredible artists and painters. Um, some of them can't sing a note, some of them have perfect pitch. But the friendships that develop, not only between the autistic people and the people with disabilities, but between the non-autistic teenagers or
Yeah.
adults. I have a friend, his name is Teddy Lytle. He's one of the co-artistic director for Spectrum Theater. Um, he's had his own issues with addiction and some other issues, but he's not neurodevelopmentally disabled. He said, I have learned more about my challenges and myself from my autistic friends. He said, I joined the company because I thought, oh, wouldn't it be nice? Let me help out these poor autistic people. He knew nothing about autism. He said he's learned more about his own life and himself by for 3 years being involved in the Spectrum
Fantastic.
Ensemble than any therapy he's ever been, anything he's ever done before.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
amazing.
Barry, can I ask you with regards, because to my knowledge, there's not a huge number of theatre groups or kind of performing arts and arts theatres that are either all autistic or that we'd say that actively recruit autistic individuals. And you mentioned that it's that at present that you guys are delivering some of these kinds of trainings on Zoom and like that kind of class and stuff. So we'd say moving forward, do you foresee that continuing on Zoom as well to accommodate individuals who might not be living in your specific localities and stuff?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's interesting because these are the discussions we're having right now.
Okay.
Similar to what I'm sure you've heard this and many listeners have heard this. With Zoom, it seems everybody thought it was going to be so difficult for students and people on the spectrum. And it seems to be 50-50, that some people prefer it
Yeah.
because it takes away all the social stress and anxiety to some extent. And as a friend, you might know Roz Blackburn. She's a good friend of
Yeah.
mine from the UK. And she says, and we had her on the podcast recently, a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And she said, if I get too stressed out, I just turn you off. That's all. You can't do that in person unless you run away, right?
She's very wise, very wise. I love Roz. She just says it like it is. She names it and says, but actually it's true. I suppose I'm thinking about kiddos here who, like, be it my own and other children who I would support. I find that some of the children actually are definitely, we'd say mentally more well in
Yeah.
themselves, where these are kids who would have maybe fallen out of school, or meeting with school refusal and so on, because suddenly the social demand has been removed, and that need and expectation to perform, so to speak, in order to meet all of these kind of societal rules and so on, has been removed. And as a result, these kiddos have become much more well in themselves again. So it's actually, there's some kids who are so much more suited to that Zoom platform than what they ever would be
Oh,
in a
yeah.
real in-person platform, do you know?
Yeah. Well, we interviewed Roz Blackburn, who is a woman in her 50s. I know Roz for 15, 20 years, who's on the spectrum, and she's so eloquent about talking about her experience. And so here's a plug for the podcast, okay? We recorded an interview with her about 3 weeks ago, and it's live. It was 2 weeks ago that it was on. And the interview began this way. She began talking about Zoom, and she said, well, Barry, you have me on because I'm an autistic person, but you know, on Zoom in my own home, you can't be autistic outside of a social interaction. So I'm really not autistic here.
Love it.
So I said
True,
to her,
though, true. To be fair, there's an element of truth to that.
I
Do I
said to her,
love
I guess I'm interviewing the neurotypical Roz version right now.
it?
But another little plug, which connects back to the acting piece. There's a movie that came out, let's see, in 2007, 2008, called Snowcake.
Okay.
And it had a woman with autism as one of the characters. The woman with autism was played by Sigourney Weaver, the famous
I've seen this movie
actor.
actually, yeah.
Well, Sigourney and Sigourney came up and spent time with us when I brought Roz over. I brought her over from the UK 3 times here. And so Sigourney many years ago spent the weekend with us. So I surprised Roz on the podcast. I invited Sigourney to be on, and Sigourney didn't, Roz didn't expect it. And I said to Roz, I have a surprise guest. Somebody wants to say hi. This was before the podcast was recorded. I said, if you want me to tell you who it is so you won't get a little anxious about the surprise, that's fine. If not, she goes, no, I want the surprise. So in our podcast released a week and a half ago, it's Roz Blackburn with Sigourney Weaver. And Sigourney talks about all that she learned from Roz in preparing for her role. And it's very touching. They've really developed a really nice friendship. It's continuing. That's what we hope. And that's what we hope the podcast will be, how much we're all learning. We do have a couple of episodes about theater. So we have an episode with members of the Spectrum Theater
Yeah.
Ensemble, and we have an episode with Elaine Hall, the founder of the Miracle Project. So if you want to learn about both of those, listen to the podcasts. Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Barry, you'll be glad to know there's only 2 more questions, because I'd
Okay.
say you're
Okay.
exhausted having to talk to me for so long.
Sharon, you are a wonderful partner in this interview. I'm having a good time.
I suppose your second last question is, where can people find out more about you and about all that you do? Because you bring so much to the table, and you've so much knowledge and information, and I suppose just kindness to offer, that it's really important that people can access more information about you, and all of that information that you can share with them.
Yeah, I would say the most up-to-date place to go is our podcasts, because literally, I am talking with Dave. I talk about my experiences. Dave asks me about that. Our first episode is Dave interviewing me about why I wrote the book Uniquely Human. So, I mean, all of that is fresh information
Yeah.
in the last 4 or 5 months. My website needs to be updated, but there's a lot of information, including free downloads of a lot of my publications
Yeah.
on the website. And if you Google me, you will see links to a lot of different radio interviews. I just did an interview from the Netherlands the other day. And most of the interviews that I do, are questions about, like what we're talking about now. How did you do this? Why are you doing this?
Yeah.
So those are the best places. And if you want to know more about what I've learned from people on the spectrum, the book Uniquely Human
Yeah.
really spells it out. Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. So, Barry, your final question
Yeah.
is, what is the most important piece of advice that you would give to anybody going through or anybody supporting someone going through their own autism journey?
Yes. I would say, and when the question comes to me that way, and it's about what would you say to parents whose son or daughter is newly diagnosed, I say, get them out into the world with the right supports. Okay. You know, that when you have different experiences and you have some challenges to being well regulated emotionally, with the right support, that's how you learn to deal with it.
Yeah.
We never know what a person is enthusiastic about until they have more varied experiences. I'm not saying sink or swim. I'm not saying put a person with autism or a child in a circumstance. So I would say to people on the spectrum, of course, this has to do with self-advocacy. Work with people who could help you understand what is helpful to you if you don't already know,
Yeah.
and then learn how to ask for that. If you're in college, learn how to say to a professor in a lecture, can I record your lecture, or could I sit up front? That is helpful for me. If you're in a school and you can request help with academics, or you could say, going into that lunchroom is too noisy. Can I eat in this other place? Whatever will help you as a person on the spectrum, whether it's just asking for help with math or asking for help making a picture of an animal, whatever it might be, people are there to join with you. One of the things I've learned the most, another friend of mine who does a lot of work online, her name is Becca Laurie. Should interview her if you haven't. She's wonderful.
Write it
And
down.
yeah, Becca Laurie Hector. She's married now. Hector.
Okay.
She says, and she gives lectures at, pre-COVID at conferences. She talks a lot about quality of life issues. And she says, I think we've spoken so much about about independence, independence, independence. And she said, well, that's fine and good, but it's not really about independence. It's about interdependence.
Yeah.
It's about knowing how to help other people understand me as a person on the spectrum, understand people on the spectrum, and it's how we help each other. It's how we work together. It's how we join. Okay. It's not about me being all on my own. I'm fine on my own. Okay. And yes, I need to learn to do some things like dress myself in the morning. Okay. Um, but the bigger picture is knowing how we all need to be together in neurotypical and autistic partnerships.
Yeah.
And when I go to schools, when I work with the Miracle Project or the Spectrum Theater Ensemble, that's when I get the huge smiles.
Yeah.
That's when I see a high school student not on the spectrum who never ever even met a person with autism working with a person with autism in their art class doing a project together, or learning how to do hip hop dance together in a dance class. That's what it's about. And again, it's not throwing people on the spectrum into the mainstream and say sink or swim. It's with the right supports that everybody could benefit from.
Barry, thank you so, so much for speaking with me today.
So it's absolutely my pleasure.